Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Lucas. Sometimes people call me Keith, circa 1992. I want to thank each of you on behalf of my mother, my sister, and our extended family for joining us here this afternoon. I make no exaggeration when I say that we have been truly humbled and overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and support that we have received from our church family, from our friends, and from the broader community over the past week. Thank you for your words of comfort, for your prayers, for the home visits, the food that you've dropped off, the flowers, hugs, phones, emails, texts, all of it. And thank you to everyone who was a part of making this service possible today. We love you all, and although we certainly wish to gather under different circumstances, we truly count it an incredible blessing to be surrounded by all of you right now. As we spent the past few days poring over home videos and photo albums, just like Leah said, my mind has also been flooded with memories of time with my dad. Growing up, I used to love listening to his memories of his childhood in Newfoundland. At all of the age of 6, he would wake up in the morning with his friends, disappear into the woods with a lunchbox in one hand and a hatchet in the other, and the only expectation was that he was home in time for dinner. Given that by contrast, I grew up in the suburbs and was duped into thinking that riding my bike to the end of the street was the pinnacle of freedom, I truly believe that my dad had lived the boyhood dream. Pops, as I often called him, was a creative giant. Each year at Christmas, we would look forward to the handmade gift that he had prepared for each one of us. And as a kid, I can remember him sitting at his computer and bringing ideas to life as a totally self-taught and yet award-winning graphic designer. His passion for design is something that he passed on to both Leah and I. You know, most people play things like I Spy to pass the time in car rides. Dad and I played Name That Font, and we ranted about bad layout and typography on the billboards and storefront signs that we passed. If you want to honor my father's memory, then I would implore you to join with me in promising today that you will never use the font papyrus under any circumstances. Amen. Please, just don't. Many in our church community will remember my dad for his involvement in the hospitality ministry. And the truth is that he really did love serving and being in the kitchen, whether here at church or at home. Growing up, he made us the most incredible birthday cakes, and I swear to this day that his banana bread is the greatest banana bread ever to grace the mouths of men and women. You know it too. I won't soon forget the Christmas when one of Dad's design clients learned of his talent in baking and commissioned him to bake 300 dozen cookies. I swear that our oven was running for 4 days straight and I wasn't able to eat a single thing. It was absolutely brutal. I like to think that I've taken after my dad in a lot of ways, including some that might not be known to most people. As a teenager, he really loved to dance, and to the surprise of many, he was often the star of the dance floor. Though we didn't like to let him revel in it, the man, we'll be honest, had a lot of swag. And I will gladly take up the mantle of fine hair and fashion that he carried so well. I wore microfloral just for him. My dad and I also shared a love for movies, especially those that involve the comic book heroes of our childhoods. And although he didn't have a chance to watch Avengers Endgame, no spoilers, those of you who have watched it will know what I mean when I say I loved him 3,000. I will remember my father as a man who was hardworking, kind-hearted, generous, and supportive. As a kid, he was always willing to help me with my school projects. And years later, when I found myself in seminary, he listened patiently whenever I processed my learning out loud. When I finished school and joined staff with Power to Change, he was a huge encouragement in my decision to move to Denmark for a year, and he became one of my largest financial supporters. As both my mother and my sister have expressed, for many years, life in our home and our family was far from easy. Nevertheless, I can honestly say that the work of healing and reconciliation that God accomplished in my father's life and in our broader family over the past 3 years has been nothing short of supernatural. At the time of his passing, I can honestly say that my dad and I were closer than ever before, that our relationship was stronger than it ever had been. My last conversation with him took place on the morning of April 30th, the same day that he was rushed to hospital. My final words to him at that time were, "I love you, Pops, and I'm praying for you." There's something deeply unifying about funerals. As we gather here today, we do so not only to celebrate my father's life and to mourn his passing. As we gather here, we are also united as we're confronted once more with the reality of our fragile humanity. Today is an opportunity to embrace the sober reminder that we live in a broken world that is marked by suffering, loss, and death. What peace and what comfort can we hope to have in the midst of such grim realities? Is there any hope that we can overcome these things? The truth is that on our own, we have no hope, and there is no peace. We may seek to make the most of our short lives. We may even succeed in mending broken relationships and persevering through hardship and learning to live with struggle and grief. But the truth is that in the end, death comes for us all. And as this week has proven to us so clearly, truly any day could be our last. As you've probably gathered by now, my father and our family with him are followers of Jesus. And at the time of his passing, my father was in the midst of reading through once again the Gospel of John, one of the earliest accounts of Jesus' life. And over the past few days, there are a few short sentences from this gospel that I've been repeating over and over again in my head. In John chapter 16, Jesus is gathered with his closest friends on the very night that he's going to be arrested and later crucified. And he says the following: "I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart, I have overcome the world." I know that if my father was here, he would want nothing more than that we would commend you to these words and to Jesus who spoke them. The only reason that my family and I have hope and peace in the midst of this sudden loss, and in truth, the only reason that any of us here can ever have real and meaningful hope and peace in the midst of the many trials and sorrows that we face in this life, is because Jesus has overcome the world. When my mother shared the story of my father's life, she referred to God as the author. And the truth is that God is an author unlike any other. You see, because God is the only author by whose words the universe itself was brought into existence. All of creation and history are the story of his writing, and you and I are characters in his epic drama. But if this is true, then days such as this one might tempt us to despair of the story in which we find ourselves and to question whether the author is really good. What you need to know is that this is not how the story began. As the opening pages of the Bible describe, the story that God is writing began with a good world full of beauty and potential, in which human beings were made in God's image, called to know him, to love him, to worship him, and to partner with him in bringing all of creation to an even greater place of flourishing. But this is not the world that we live in today. And the sobering truth is that the brokenness in our lives and the world around us can be traced back to the reality that each one of us has rebelled against the author and rejected his design and purposes for our lives. As a result, we find ourselves as characters born into battle, subject to pain, to rejection, to abuse, to neglect, to shame, to the weight of our own failures and shortcomings, and ultimately to the fear of death itself. But you see, God is an author unlike any other. Because this author looked upon a world bound by suffering and death. And in his great love and tender mercy, he was moved to action. He is the only author who writes himself into his own story that he might redeem the characters that he so loves. God is not a God who stands aloof and detached from our mourning today. Rather, he entered fully into our experience. The very same author and God whose words brought the world into existence is the same God whose word took on flesh and came to dwell among us. His name is Jesus. And by becoming a human being, Jesus embraced fully our frailty, our weakness, our limitations. The Bible describes him as a man of sorrows, one who was well acquainted with grief. And yet amazingly, Jesus came not simply to identify with our sufferings, but to overcome them, indeed to overcome the world itself. Nearly 2,000 years ago, Jesus of Nazareth, a true man who lived and walked this earth, took upon himself the weight of all our sin and shame. all of our brokenness, all of our sorrows and failures, all our sickness and death, every power of evil, and he swallowed it by allowing it to swallow him. He is not the God who stands indifferent to our pain. He is the God who weeps, the God who bleeds. The author of life is the author who dies in our place. Yet as we celebrated just a few weeks ago at Easter, the grave could not hold this author. And after 3 days in darkness, Jesus rose victorious over death itself, overcoming the world by the power of his life and his love. And today he sits enthroned above all things as the true Lord of creation. For this reason, the overcoming power of Jesus' life is available today to all who will receive him by faith. And so whatever chapter of your story that you may find yourself in right now, today, our prayer is that you would hear the author cry out to you, "Come to me. Come to me. I am the author. Bring me your story just as it is. Bring me all of your hurts. Bring me all of your sorrows, all of the shame, all of the guilt, every regret and mistake, every form of pain that you bear. Come to me. I have overcome the world." The author would say to you today, allow me to write words of hope in the pages of your life. Let me pen words of forgiveness, of healing, of transformation. I have overcome the world. You see, my father heard the author call out to him, and he responded by surrendering his life to Jesus. And in the past 3 years, the author was busy writing a new chapter of hope and of healing and of transformation, as he has promised to do to all who will come to him. And we do not know why he saw it fit in his perfect wisdom to pen the end of my dad's story here on earth, but we do know that his story is not yet over. Rather, just as Jesus announced in that same gospel at the funeral of his friend Lazarus, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die." And so, dear brothers and sisters and beloved friends, may we be reminded today that if we have trusted in Jesus, if we have united our lives to the author of life itself, then we do not grieve as those who have no hope. Rather, and on the contrary, although we grieve, and although we know today that we will have many more sorrows and trials in this life, we rejoice with the certain truth that Jesus has overcome the world. There is nothing that we need to fear in this life. One day the author has promised that he will return for all who have trusted in him. Toby read of that day earlier. Then begins the final chapter of the story that God began writing in eternity. And let me tell you, it is a chapter that will never end. The author has himself promised that he will wipe away every stain and every trace of evil, of suffering and death that remains in this world, that he will restore all of creation to a place of wholeness and rest, and that we will dwell with him forever. The final pages of the Bible describe the beginning of this chapter like this. "And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the dwelling place of God is with humanity. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away.' And he who was seated on the throne said, 'Behold, I am making all things new.' Also he said, 'Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true.' And the author said, 'It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end.'"